Hello, everyone. Welcome to this live stream. There's been some interesting developments in the past day or two around the war in Iran. Now, if you're a regular, you'll know that we talk to Larry Johnson quite a lot, but it's important to get different perspectives. And I speak to Larry quite a lot because he's often able to jump on at quite short notice. But there's also some very important developments that have just happened in the Strait of Hormuz, which I think were worth a look at. Now, the US basically denied reports from the Iranians that had said that they had fired missiles in the direction of some US Navy vessels that have been supposedly harassing other neutral third party ships. Quickly, I think it becomes apparent that this is one side's narrative versus another's, one claiming that the other has been harassing versus the other that denies any and all form of knowledge about it. And therefore, this is, well, it's just a war of words, it's information warfare, it's propaganda, and who's doing a better job of winning that narrative or framing that narrative and winning the minds of everyone else watching. And right now, it looks like the Iranians do definitely have the upper hand, although we've seen in the past that when they've claimed something hasn't happened, it might have happened in some way, shape, or form. Both sides stretch the truth, but it's more the question of who's more desperate to frame it in such a specific way. And the more that this goes on, the more apparent it is to me, and I think quite a few people, that the United States, or specifically Donald Trump, is really trying hard to influence the narrative, to try and find a way to frame the situation as being okay, it's manageable. The United States has it under control, and that there is a peace deal imminent. The peace deal is on the way. But this has been going on for the best part of 2 weeks now, and we've not really seen anything in the way of a comprehensive agreement being established. This MOU, which is not a complicated thing really to do, to acquire, to assess, to establish, if you know how to do it, which Trump doesn't, it's taking a long time relative to what an MOU should be. So, because at the end of the day, keep in mind, an MOU is just the framework for actually establishing a deal. So these guys are just trying to agree on what to agree on, and they can't even do that. So the more that Trump keeps emphasizing, having to repeat, having to sort of really emphasize that there is a deal imminent, shows that he's pretty desperate for one, but things don't look quite as cushy as the United States would like you to believe. Or he would like you to believe as well. Meanwhile, he's getting distracted with his suggestions over his mega ballroom in the White House and the cost of that, and of course, just generally the situation. But on the other hand, the recent breaking news has been that the US naval blockade has bled Iran of nearly $6 billion in oil revenue. So that's a sixth of what the oil it was shipping before the war began. You know, the blockade, or the number of ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz before February 28 varied between 130, 140 ships. Now it's a tenth of that, if that, a tenth. If you get double digits, that's a good day. And this is where the escalation remains. The US action has come because the Strait of Hormuz is probably the most important waterway in the world, and the US is trying to enforce the capitulation with the Iranians by essentially doing a blockade of a blockade. But that's not really an effective strategy. If you look at any map, such as this one here, you quickly see that it's not a long-term viable means. Just sharing this, look, if you look here near Bandar Abbas, this is coming from Al Jazeera, it's this area which the IOGCs talk about their control over the Strait of Hormuz, but then the US goes even further. It's more sort of out here, beyond the territorial waters and outside towards the Gulf of Oman, and then the other side being around sort of upwards of the Abu Dhabi sort of area around Syria. So this level of complexity in a narrow stretch of water, which is not wide. You can, in some days, very clear days, see, especially without question in this section up here, you can see both sides. You can see the mainland of Iran and you can see the mainland of the UAE or Oman, respectively, depending upon where you are. But that's the point. This is not an easy body of water, but essentially now, new data is arguing that what's happened since the US began its naval blockade is that its oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz have essentially flatlined. But most interestingly of all is that the Iranians have had to particularly cut that selling to China. So some people who argue that this whole war was actually about China are going to be arguing that it's been effective because the Iranians are not supplying the Chinese, and therefore the Chinese and their stock reserves are not going well. Now, I also wanted to say that we are supposed to be being joined by Aaron David Miller, but I'm waiting to see if he will join us in the next few minutes. He's a former State Department official who's been advising quite a few different US government staff. So yeah, let me just see if he's joining us. Yeah, so essentially that's looking at some of the data. The Iranian crude grades generally traded about $90 a barrel and occasionally exceeded 100. So exports of around 300,000 would generate about $27 million in revenue a day, or $837 million over an entire month. What would have been May, right? If estimations serve rightly, because there's also variations on month and time of year. So in March, when exports averaged around 184 million barrels per day, Iran was estimating a range of around $165 million a day in revenue, or about 55.1 billion a month. So 830 million sounds pretty good, but for a nation state whose oil exports are one of its key bedrocks of its income, to be not even breaking a billion is catastrophic. Conversely, in April, that they generated about 120 million barrels a day, or roughly 3.6 billion. So down from 5.1 to 3.6, which is 1.5 billion. That's a significant drop of about a quarter. But then to drop it down to under a billion, that's a seismic cut. And I don't think anyone who does basic economics would deny it's difficult really to sort of imagine what those numbers really mean. They're essentially oil revenues in May, just based on the maths, compared to March, were 84% lower. Now, if it was a third lower, a lot of nations would be pretty rattled at the loss of 1.5 billion. But to have 84% lower is just a suggestion of how big a deal this is for the Iranians. Now, some people argue that this is being offset a little bit by the toll or by the income that the Iranians are making from sort of charging fleets, vessels to go through, but it's a fraction. It would be not even a tenth of the overall income that they would be earning from the oil. So to me, it's untenable. And this is why, whilst a lot of emphasis is put on the sustainability of Trump's campaign and his political capital, a lot of emphasis should also be on the economy of the Iranians. What's interesting is just how resilient the Iranian, sort of like the Russian economy, has been in the past several years. There's often been the emphasis on sanctions and the capacity for the Iranians to respond. Yeah, it's unfortunately just so big for the Iranians that they I don't think even they're going to have a lot of leeway here. I've also just got a message from Aaron who says he's probably not going to be able to make it, at least right now. So what I'm probably going to do is just sort of share some of my broader thoughts for the time being, and then maybe will reconvene for Aaron's appearance. So let me just write that. But yeah, so the other question is sort of, is Iran producing? I think that's one of the key, that's another really interesting point, because for now, the Iranians have been increasingly forced to store the crude that it can't sell. They're using storage capacity in quite an effective way, and data shows the blockade is working, but the real pressure comes once that storage starts coming out. You can't just, it's like any energy provision. One of the key emphases about Russia is, for example, you can't just turn off oil or gas pipelines because it just stops. It's not that easy. You turn it off, you can't just turn it on again. This is what's happened with Qatar. They've now stopped producing and providing the world with critical LNG. And that's going to take them a couple of years, really, to get back to what they were before. It's a systemic challenge for the Qataris at this point. So for the Iranians, much of their storage is actually floating on tankers just in the sea. And about 147 million barrels of Iranian crude and what's known as condensate are being held in that floating storage. So of that total, about 70 million are stranded inside the Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. They can't pass through the US blockade. So the US blockade is having an intended effect, but of course it's the trade-off of it affects the Iranians disproportionately, but it also significantly harms the Americans and certain American allies like the Gulf states. So Iran, for what it's worth, has increasingly relied on oil tankers as temporary storage facilities. So they load the crude onto the vessels and then leave them anchored offshore while it searches for ways to move those cargoes around. But of course, those are then tankers that are not being used to transit what could be used. So it's, again, a bit of an opportunity cost. Now, one question that I've had, and I think a lot of people wonder, is sort of, how do some exports still get through? And is that possible to still continue? So around 300,000 billion barrels per day are eluding the US blockade, or at least that's what some people suggest. That some vessels still pass through these maritime boundaries because Iran has found ways to bypass these restrictions, some of the restrictions at least, which is why exports continue. That's why I mentioned about sort of like maybe 10, 15 vessels can get through occasionally. The blockade's effect has not been to stop production, but to interrupt the flow of money from what oil sells, right? It's more about the overall flow transiting, not so much the production itself, although of course it's a trickle-down effect. It doesn't necessarily mean there's an immediate economic shock. So it's quite, yeah. I see Aaron's been able to make it.
I am. Yeah.
Hello.
Been a little confusing here, but let's do it. I know you don't have a whole lot of time.
No, it's all right. We've got a good half an hour if that works for you. We are live, so it's great to see you again, Aaron. I'm just taking through the audience a little bit about the extent of the oil situation, because from my understanding, the US blockade is now costing the Iranians upwards of $6 billion. So
it's $500 million a day. That includes 90% of Iran's imports are seaborne. So they're not. It's not. I mean, they have routes through the Caspian Sea. They're smuggling rates, but yeah, the Iranians are bearing a heavy burden. There's no doubt about it. The latest interview which CNN ran with a military advisor to most
Aaron,
of
there's a lot of reverb. I think there's something up with your microphone. I don't know if you're using the right microphone.
Let me see. This should be better. I hope it is.
No, you've got a lot of echo. Like it sounds like you're in underwater.
Well, this is the mic for the DJI mic, which is synced to StreamYard right now.
There you go.
Okay, great.
No, it sounded better just then, but then it went away again.
There's not much I can do. There's not much.
There you go. There you go.
I think this is better.
There you go. Just you can look like a millennial and hold the microphone.
Exactly. Unfortunately.
Well, it's good to see you, Aaron.
Yeah,
you too. You are. Aaron David Miller is one of the America's foremost experts on the Middle East, UN foreign policy, and of course Iran. And we had you on, I think, back in April, Aaron. And what I was taking the audience through simply was that in the time between that the US blockade has come into force, it's dropped. Revenue has dropped from, I think it was about 5.1 billion in March to around 837 million now in May. So that's an 84% drop in a couple of months. How do you interpret that figure from the US perspective?
I mean, as I mentioned, I think the current figure I had is the Iranians are losing $500 million a day, $500 million a day. Because of the blockade. The question is, what is their pain threshold, and is it higher or lower than Washington's? So far, there's no indication to suggest that any amount of military or economic pressure is going to fundamentally change their calculations. I just listened to an interview that CNN did with the military advisor to Mojtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader. And he basically said that negotiations are at an impasse, and the U.S. has to release at least $12 billion in frozen assets as a sign of good faith. So it strikes me that we're in a sort of a twilight zone between the prospects of real escalation, not tit for tat that we've seen, serious escalation, in the possibility of a diplomatic pathway. I just don't see much opportunity right now for any give in either Iran's position or in Trump's. Trump mentioned the other day we could see the blockade go on until Labor Day. Now, the oil markets have been remarkably stable. Brent should be much more than 90 plus. And the reason it's not, there are several reasons. Number one is inventories, which were flush when this conflict began. Second is depressed global demand. A third is you had a lot of floating oil, that is to say, oil at sea, which had been sanctioned. And the Americans lifted sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil in order to feed the market. And finally, I think the administration has been brilliant at using Trump's social media posts to basically persuade the oil market that a deal was right around the corner. But the longer you go into the summer season, particularly the driving season here, the greater the chances of a dramatic rise in the price of oil as inventories run out. And that's not just oil; it's natural gas. We in the Qataris are the world's two largest producers. And the Ras Laffan natural gas facility, the Qataris produce 25% of global natural gas. That facility has been damaged by Iranian strikes, and according to some, would take years to repair. So everybody is hurting. Least of all, the international economy is here. The Asia Pacific, those countries are really getting hammered. Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan. The Americans are relatively, by and large, relatively well insulated. Gas was down 20% a gallon last week. The stock market was up 1.6% yesterday. The employment numbers came out today showing robust growth. I'm telling you, this guy Trump has only one constraint: his fear of being seen to be a loser, a sucker, and an emboldener of a regime he wanted to undermine. And until he gets a deal, quote unquote, something that he can claim success, we're not getting out of this.
So what I hear is quite a few different strands there from Jan. Also, point of note: if you take the microphone a little bit further away from your mouth, because then you won't get quite so much breath on them.
I just want to make sure you can hear me now. Can you hear me
it's
now?
good. Right. Yeah, you're good. No, as I say, I hope you enjoyed your moment as a Gen Z influencer. It was good.
Right. It's a moment.
No, it's fine. But I'm interested, therefore, because on the one hand, you talk about the incredible craftsmanship of Trump to use, or his team to use, his social medias to sort of keep the markets less volatile. But then on the other hand, there seems to be, to me at least, a tug of war between Trump's ego and the regime's survival. And I think it's pretty clear that one has a greater existentialism than the other. One is more likely to bend, even though Trump doesn't want to admit that. I think it's that he has to forgo something in this. Otherwise, he's stuck in this war. So, like, how long can the United States administration manage Trump's own shortcomings? Because I think that's a critical. He seems to conflict his own team half the time.
I mean, what are the drivers? What are the constraints? Yeah, midterms. He's not on the ballot. He can blame Republican losses on bad candidates. He's already mad at the Republican Party because they're challenging him. Mm-hmm. So is he worried about the average American, the affordability issue? He's already spoken publicly. He says he's not. I'm telling you, I think the biggest constraint is his fear of being deemed to be a loser. And to avert that, he needs something. He needs to be able to spin a win that isn't just spin. And right now, on the two critical issues that will determine who won and who lost this war, I think the Iranians have more cards to play. One is the Straits, which will take weeks, even if you had a deal to open. And who knows what the Iranians, I think the Iranians want to be paid for reopening something that was already open the day before the war started. They want unfrozen assets, billions. Is he going to give that to them? That would be a real sucker play. The second is enrichment. He said today that he's not worried. He said, we don't have to go get the HEU. We know where it is. Well, I think he's making a virtue out of a necessity. Going to get that HEU would raise serious risks of casualties on the American side. You need a large force deployment because you'd have to cordon off an area and dig that stuff out. That's going to take time.
This makes me think of Karg Island. It makes me think of all the idea of specialist forces, 4,000 troops being used somehow to seize the enriched uranium, right? All those discussions, I think that's around about the time we first spoke, have largely evaporated, unsurprisingly, I think. But what is the play then? From my understanding, the Iranians threatened to fire actual missiles. They fired warning shots, they claim earlier today. The CENTCOM have denied that. So it just seems to me like it's all about the war of words, the psychological warfare, smoke and mirrors play than it is actual engagement at this point. Or do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, you're poised between no diplomacy. No diplomacy and no negotiation.
I think I triggered someone in the White House with that question.
Right.
But when we hear news of strikes, right, launching missiles at the U.S. Navy, is that not something that could jeopardize the entire peace process? Then, well, that's more about
if either intentionally or unintentionally, somebody institutes or deploys a major military move, which essentially goes beyond some sort of proportionate response, either by accident or intentionally. You get a mass casualty event, one of these missiles hits an American base, and 20, 30 Americans are killed. Trump's already said if Americans are killed, he'll escalate. So there's always that danger. And I think the Iranians also, there's an argument by people who follow Iranian politics on a much more granular level than I do, that the Iranians feel that the ceasefire is causing them to lose their advantage. That they've got to raise the costs to the United States somehow, or to the Gulf states. I don't know what that is.
Well, okay, I want to get to a big crux, which was the past couple of days. Some people have claimed that they had sources that suggested the Iranians were capable of getting a nuclear bomb, or that they had one already, and that this information was made aware to the White House. Have you heard about this, or is this completely nonsense?
No, I haven't. And I was born in Ohio, but the slogan for the state of Missouri is the show me state. So I just, no. Do I think the Iranians have a deliverable nuclear weapon? No. Do I think they are a latent nuclear weapon state? That is to say, they have all the elements and the know-how. They have the fissile material. They've got the computer modeling. They know how to miniaturize the warhead. This thing takes time. These things take time, and they can be done in smaller laboratories, which are much more discreet, much more hard to find. So I think that's where this regime is going. They want to become a latent nuclear weapons threshold state. They would argue that this never would have happened had the Iranians had a bomb. Same argument that Gaddafi used, same argument that Saddam used, and the arguments that a true nuclear weapon state, North Korea, uses.
So those who have claimed this are a couple of people who you may have heard of being, shall we say, of a opposing view to the mainstream. Larry Johnson, and I think he's called Pepe Escobar. These are independent people who are often appearing on alternative media outlets, and they've claimed that there's been some kind of unconfirmed source or a single source, which is very convenient, that the Iranians have actively been able to acquire a weapon. Now,
okay, so let's assume for the sake of argument they're right. So what is that? So what?
Well, doesn't that change the entire calculus of the U.S. grand strategy towards?
Well, but we've just conducted. I mean, assuming if they have it now, they had it on February 28th. And the U.S. and Israel have conducted a massive military campaign. Didn't seem to stop the U.S. And what are the Iranians going to deploy? Is it a tactical nuclear weapon? They're going to deploy a tactical nuclear weapon. You have radiation linkage. You have weather patterns are extremely important here. And then, of course, there's the response of Iran using a nuclear weapon against whom? Against what? Do they have the capacity to strike the continental United States? This is not a crazy regime. This is a regime interested in survival. The use of a nuclear weapon against Israel or the Gulf states or Europe, if they had a reliable delivery system to hit the United States.
Well, there's two things to that, Aaron, because I think it was back in early May, there was that revelation that the Iranians may well have capabilities that could reach Diego Garcia. Now, I don't know if you view that as...
Yeah, but with what, a single strike? To do what? They've got 20 U.S. military bases, literally within miles. Their short-range ballistic missiles and drones have already proven that they can hit U.S. military bases. And if you believe the BBC reports, the damage to those bases are much more extensive than this administration is letting on. So they don't need to hit Europe. They have deployed horizontal escalation, and they've done it in a way that is incredibly powerful. They've turned geography into a weapon. They don't need a nuke to get the world's attention. They don't need a nuke to hold the world's economy hostage. They don't need a nuke to compromise the future of the Gulf states. The Dubai model is now completely up in the air. You want to turn the Gulf into a financial, a high-tech center of culture and sports and finance. You need security and stability to do that. And the Iranians have demonstrated there is no security and stability. One more point. You also need a degree of openness. And you see what's happening. These states are cracking down on domestic dissent, particularly on Shia, indigenous Shia communities. That's going to mean that they're going to be more authoritarian, more oppressive, and more concerned with their own security. And they're going to face an embittered, angry, powerful Iranian regime with whom they're going to have to figure out a way to deal. So the Iranians don't need a nuclear weapon I mean, again, I just, when you talk about Putin's use of, had Ukrainians broken through and taken back Crimea, or were about to, I think Putin might have deployed a tactical nuke in Ukraine.
Wow, that's quite Crimea is particularly well. Okay. So that's an interesting line of thought there, Aaron. So the claim that these guys have made is that the warhead, if they tested it, it would be done as a demonstration, and it could be done underground, right, as a way to not actually strike someone, just to show that they have the capability of this weapon. But to me, that seems like a wastage of the weapon, because you don't exactly have tons of warheads.
I just don't see how. Had Iran had a nuclear stockpile of deliverable tactical or strategic nuclear weapons before this campaign, an administration would have given second thought. That they developed it now, when the U.S. continues to strike Iran with impunity whenever it wants, when it's created a naval blockade that's costing the Iranians $500 million a day. I can't imagine under what circumstances this regime would deploy a nuclear weapon, knowing what the consequences would be.
So then the other factor to this then is, you mentioned Mojtaba. So I kind of want to get your thoughts on that. Is that the first time we've actually heard from him? Because as far as I'm aware,
he's had pronouncements that have been issued in his name. Look, I'm not an Iranian expert. I don't play one on TV or on podcasts. I think that the degree of opacity, we cannot see through this veil. Most of the reputable, I'm interviewing Danny Citranovich, who is the IDF's top military analyst on Iran for 20 years. Danny's read on Iran is the best read. On Tuesday, I'm interviewing him. Danny's read is the best read of any Iranian analyst out there. And I think that even Danny can't predict or fundamentally understand what is the role of Khomeini's son, al-Khamenei's son. I don't either. So who knows? Trump's offering to meet him.
Well, he said he's a great guy or something, didn't he? He seems to have a real appeal for the alternative types like Kim Jong-un and now Mojtaba Khaname. So this leads me to a broader thing that I've been postulating on for a long time. And I was very curious to hear your thoughts, which is, I personally think that this war has given Iran an unprecedented amount of strategic clarity. I know you're not an Iranian expert, but could you agree that Trump's war of choice has enabled the Iranians to recognize that a nuclear bomb isn't actually their biggest asset? The Strait of Hormuz is geography, as you mentioned before, right?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And it's emboldened the regime. I mean, there will be a bill to pay after the war ends, and at some point it will end or de-escalate. You're going to see protests again to a regime that has less legitimacy. Maybe you have a rally around the flag effect now because of the war, but the economy is in shambles. Expectations will rise. Iran is going to need a lot of economic money, financial money, in order to begin to piece this back together again. I think that the single most important thing that has happened, other than weaponizing geography, was the killing of Ali Khamenei, because he has more than anyone else, he is responsible for the policies of the Islamic Republic since he ascended in 1989. Whatever form it emerges in, it will not be the same Iran, because he's out of the picture. And whether it's a more militarized, securitized elite running the country, whether the clerics have let them, what I call the malacracy, has less influence over policy, how ideology and prosperity equate. My colleague Kurzin Jaipur, who's an outstanding analyst of Iran, believes that for decades, ideology was more important than prosperity, and the Iranians were prepared to sacrifice prosperity in the service of their revolution and their ideology. Will that change now? You have a bunch of hard men who are not clerics running this country. They control the oil, the guns, the money, the information. They're going to have to run and administer this state going forward. So I don't know how it's going to change.
No, I've wanted to get Karim on for a while. Actually, his takes are some of the most astute, I think, of anyone I listen and watch. I guess it's just from a sort of US strategic perspective then. You know, Trump's now forever stuck in the Middle East. Would you not agree that even if the war does come to some kind of closure, he's now going to be mopping up the mess? And I'm primarily thinking about in the context of Israel.
I don't know. Colin Powell, actually, it's Tom Friedman, basically said it's a pottery barn rule. You break it, you own it. I think Trump's view of the Middle East is, I broke it, you own it. I don't think Trump is committed to, you look around, Syria has been an interesting issue for him. Gaza is divided, dysfunctional, and sporadically violent. There's a ceasefire after a fashion, but Hamas is not going to disarm. Lebanon is going to continue to be a mess. But none of this is going to involve huge amounts of American military deployment of American forces. He's certainly not going to pay for any of this. There won't be any money other than what it costs to wage war, the $30 billion or so that it's cost. So no, this is not Trump's Vietnam. Someone said to me, this is Trump's Vietnam. No, it's not. This is not Iraq and Afghanistan. Vietnam, 53,000 Americans died.
But how can Trump untangle himself?
It's the straits, Pyotr. That's the issue. The ultimate disposition of whether he wins or loses won't hinge on the nuclear issue, because whatever gesture the Iranians make, it won't be enough to validate his notion that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. I think this bunch basically is going to accelerate their desire for a weapon. No. Who controls the straits will be the single most visible manifestation of who wins and who loses. And right now, if the war stopped today, this is a strategic defeat. Epic fury is epic disaster.
Epic failure. Come on, use some alliteration there.
Epic failure. So one other point that's worth making, as the Arab world continues to melt down, and as the Gulf states, who are the biggest losers in this, I would make a point to you and your listeners that if you were to ask me who are the three most important states in this region today, I would say without hesitation, the three non-Arabs: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. They all have tremendous economic potential. They all have very adept militaries and security organizations. One is a member of NATO. One is still America's closest ally. And the third has demonstrated that it is still a regional power. The three non-Arabs, for good or ill, are the only states in this region that can project their power in a meaningful way beyond their borders. You might add the Emirates to that, but it's a matter of scale here. You can't compare the UAE to Israel, and you can't compare it to Turkey, and you can't compare it to Iran.
But Turkey's always had a very sidelined approach ever since his Erdogan's effort at neo-Ottomanism. Sort of a lot of Middle Eastern states were like, we're not overly keen on that. Israel seems to be increasingly hemorrhaging its relationship with the US, or at least Netanyahu's pushing it with Trump. I don't know if you'd agree with that. Iran, yeah, it has a lot of potential, but the economy is shot now. I'm surprised that you say that there.
They're all keepers. They're highly functional states. And when you compare them to the following states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, come on, who are we kidding here? These are 5 Arab states that are either in state failure or profound dysfunction. There was a time, Pyotr, when Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were the 3 most powerful states in this region. They defined the Arab-Israeli conflict. They defined external relations with the great powers. Where are they? They're all offline. They're all offline. The Gulf was the thing, but the Gulf has just been hammered. And the Gulf is at odds with itself. Look at the UAE and Saudi. I mean, and the Emirates have doubled down on their relationship with Israel. They let the Israelis deploy Iron Dome. They've criticized their Gulf neighbors for not standing up to Iran while the Israelis came and bailed them out. We got to wake up and smell the coffee here. The Arab world is melting down. Power and functionality resides in these 3 states, and they're not going anywhere. I rest my case. They all have challenges. They all have big problems. 100%.
But how can you say that the Saudis are not a player? Okay,
I didn't say they weren't a player, but they can't project their power in the way the Israelis or Iranians can. They're running scared. They're the 4th largest expenditure on military equipment in the world, and yet they're defenseless. They're weak. They require an American security umbrella to protect them.
Well, maybe they don't want America anymore, as we see what's happening.
Well, they don't have much of a choice, because if in fact if CENTCOM wasn't around on February 28th, can you imagine the degree of destruction that Iran could have invoked on these Gulf states?
How sustainable is this, though, for the Iranians? Because the economy underpins a lot of it.
I don't think it is. I mean, how sustainable is it? We're in the 4th month of this war, and Iranian demand seem to be going up, not down. Have you seen any fracturing on the part of the regime? Have you seen an iota of public protest?
Well, they've been conducting executions. They've been conducting efforts to suppress.
Right. Is my point. They, other than the Chinese, they probably execute more people a year than any other country. The Middle East is a mess, and America is
the cause of that?
That's the basic problem for the United States. It cannot extricate itself, and it cannot transform the region in ways that it would like. So if there's no extrication and there's no transformation, what then is a sensible policy for the United States? I would say it's smart transaction. You identify your interests. You assure that means and ends are available to protect those interests. You help when you can, but you avoid any notion that you can somehow reshape or refashion this region. You can't. At any rate, This
But
is
isn't this fundamentally, though, what this is all about? Trump thought he could. This was all about regime change. This was all about...
right, and the Israelis believe that too. And once again, American ideas on peacemaking and war making have more often than not gone to this region to die. And on that optimistic, positive note, I think we've come to the end of our session. Anytime you want to do it again, let me know.
Well, Aaron, I have one last question for you then before you go.
Yeah.
As the host, I have to do the signing off. Otherwise, it looks unprofessional, right? Which is simply that. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I guess what I would simply ask you is then, you make a lot of very definitive statements, or you're quite definitive on what you think is the state of play. But if we were to reconvene by the end of the summer, probably before that, hopefully before that, and nothing has changed, how long can this merry-go-round, which is the analogy I use it because I just think it's a joke, a circus, how long can this continue to go round? What will be the actual cost to the US economy? What will it take for the US administration, forget Trump, for the broader machine around him to be like, okay, we need to do something because our POTUS isn't?
I think unless you see oil at 130, 40, $50 a barrel, Brent at 130, 40, $50 a barrel, unless you see a severe rise in unemployment and an inflationary cycle that surprises, unless you see real damage to the American economy, the way Trump's policies have damaged other economies. Because here's, and I would answer that question with this one: where's the rest of the world? The Europeans are marginal to this. The Russians are getting rich, and the Chinese, even though they want to see the straits open, they've insulated themselves with coal, with renewables, with huge inventories. So maybe at some point, China will, I don't know. But right now, I cannot see one definitive, I just can't predict a moment that will somehow shock or impel the two major combatants, Iran and the US.
Isn't it about Israel and Netanyahu's willingness to do stuff in Lebanon? In your 24 years of State Department experience dealing with the Tel Aviv, as well as during the time that the Islamic Republic was becoming the force that it is today, hasn't that taught you anything about where this could go because of it?
No, because Lebanon's problems will survive this conflict. Gaza's and the West Bank's problems will continue. The 5 Arab states I mentioned will continue to cope with failure and dysfunction. The 3 non-Arabs will continue about their merry way. This is a region of the world which cannot be resolved. There's no transformation here. I can't identify for you a single problem in this region that has a definitive or comprehensive solution. Not one.
Well, on that cheery note, it's time to end. Aaron, thank you so much for your time.
We'll do it again, Aaron. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Great to see you as always.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. That was Aaron David Miller, everybody, the expert from the Center of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, literally opposite my university when I lived there. And as you can see, a man of pretty strong, I think, assertions. I don't know if I agree with him on everything. I think he has a pretty cold, calculating assessment of things, but I think that something has to give, and I think a large array of pressure from Israel, the economy in Iran, as he said, he didn't have as much experience with Iran itself, and we've spoken to a lot of people from Iran who are knowledgeable about Iran, who would probably differ with some of his thoughts. But I really appreciate you guys watching. Hope you have a good weekend. I'm coming to you from Italy right now. We were in Africa, and then I was in London, and now I'm back in Italy. The ever-changing podcast. Traveling podcast as well. But yeah, I do these streams. I'm probably going to start shifting back to doing some pre-recorded videos because the intensity of information is not as high. And also because I found that my channel doesn't seem to perform as well in certain formats. Now, some of you might not think that matters, but as someone who has to balance content creation with, of course, this is still my job, it's a tricky one. And I've been having to do some revisements of the way that I do the channel. It's been a pretty intense few months. And I want to revert to a little bit more of what I was doing before, including doing more on Russia and Ukraine again, and some more solo video analysis. So be on the lookout for that. But what I was going to say is, if those of you who are interested, then do let me know in the comments now. Just give me a sense, but of maybe a weekly live stream, like every Wednesday and every Sunday, or every Sunday and every Thursday or Monday, sort of thing. Something that we can come together and sort of have a review of stuff, not necessarily 3 hours long, but like, an hour or something, to sort of deliberate some of the latest developments. And it's not necessarily going to be a guest. Sometimes it will be a guest with me, but it will always be at the same time that I will have a live stream and I can take you through some of my thoughts as well. But that's just if you think that's a good idea, if you think that would be interesting, then drop a comment or just let me know. And yeah, I'm thinking of doing sort of like 6-7 p.m. on the UK time, like every Sunday, Tuesday, and then maybe Thursday or something. But otherwise, guys, thanks very much for watching. And do, of course, like the video, do subscribe if you haven't already. We try to cover a wide array of things on this channel and actually cut through the noise of hysteria and be more measured and informative about it, but with a good bit of British sense of humor. But we'll see you all soon.